Hey, VimConf. It's great to be here with you virtually. Thanks a lot for tuning into my session. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. My name is Brian Phelps, and I'm excited to talk to you today about a code editor I've been working on called Onivim. Just a little about me. I'm the founder of a startup called Outrun Labs. I previously worked at Microsoft. You can find me on GitHub, Twitter, and Discord as Bright. And in this next half hour, I'm going to take you on a journey with me, talking Onivim and my vision of modal editing from the future. My ideal code editor, something that combines the power of both Vim and VSCode. I think it might be good to start with some background. I want to share with you how I got into Vim and modal editing. My Vim journey started in college. Often we'd have assignments that needed to be committed to source control. So my relationship with Vim and VI at that point was steps on a professor's handout. Essentially a commit tool. But primarily, I was using a lot of Visual Studio. I was doing stuff like XNA game development, using C#, visualstudio.net, and I loved it. I thought it was such a great and productive environment. In a sense, could basically read your mind. It felt like you barely had to type at all to code. It's a premier insert mode experience. And this love affair with Visual Studio might have continued indefinitely, if not for one specific plane ride. This was 2015. It was simpler times. You didn't have to wear a face mask to fly. There was no global pandemic. And I hadn't yet discovered the rabbit hole that Vim and modal editing would take me down. Now, you MacBook users won't be able to empathize with me, but I was coding on some Windows laptop. I forgot exactly what model, but I wanted to get some work done on the plane. I made the cardinal sin of forgetting my USB mouse at home. And I was at the mercy of this trackpad. And this trackpad, unlike my MacBook trackpad, was just horrible and unusable. Even though I knew the Visual Studio shortcuts, I was a power user. It was so slow to edit. It was this terrible plight where I knew exactly what I wanted my code to look like, but the actual editing experience was limited by this touchpad. And it became the bottleneck for me. And it's so frustrating because a key to productivity is being able to iterate quickly. I'm sure many of you at this conference can empathize with this, where your editing speed is the bottleneck for whatever reason. It's very, very frustrating. So I thought, wouldn't it be great if you could control the cursor with the keyboard, skip using the mouse, do all these rich edits and navigation without a touchpad, move around, swap lines. And I realized, there's already an editor that does all this, and I've used it. And that's when I rediscovered Vim. And I went all in. I was gobbling up tutorials, reading books, and I was really enjoying my rediscovery, like playing with macros, leveling up my dot files. I had all these functions and scripts for refactoring. I was learning all these tricks. I felt like a Padawan, training to be a code editing Jedi Master. Then it came time to get some real work done. I opened up GVim, bring open my C# project. I crack my knuckles. I'm ready to code circles around my previous self. I start typing, and boom, nothing. No IntelliSense. Well, I guess I have keyword completion, but it's not quite the same. It doesn't have the same smarts about my code. Couldn't read my mind. I lost that premier insert mode experience that I had from the Visual Studio world. So this really begins my journey to get a comparable insert mode experience in Vim. So I tried to bring completion to Vim. Of course, I started with the basic keyword completion, omni completion, uCompleteMe, SuperTab, deoplete, custom omnifuncs. Unfortunately, nothing compared to that rich experience I had from Visual Studio. So I was kind of stuck. I felt like I tried everything. I went the other way. I tried bringing Vim to other editors. I bought a plugin called VSVim to use Vim inside Visual Studio. It was cool, but it missed the rich split management and some workflows that I wanted from Vim. I use Sublime with vintage mode. And of course, the last stop for me was VSCode plus the Vim plugin. And it's actually really great, but I missed having the functionality of Vim across the shell and UI. It still felt like a bolted on experience. I really wanted to like VS Code and Vim, even contributing a relative lines plugin. But I think in the back of my mind, I felt like modal editing was kind of underserved in any environment. It was always a second-class citizen when you bolted on, or the language features were a second-class citizen when you bolt those onto Vim. Now, maybe I could have just used Liren's talk on how to make Vim an IDE, but at the time, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter which way I went, it always felt like I was making a compromise. So I tried my hand at building some things to solve this. The very first incarnation was this Vim plugin called Vim Electrify. And it was just a node-powered API for Vim that had completion providers. And my goal for this was just to hook up TypeScript completion and have the TypeScript language server available in Vim. While I was working on that project, I discovered NeoVim and the way it supported front-end UI. And I thought this was so exciting. So Onivim V1 was born. Onivim V1 was built on Electron. That isn't always a popular choice, especially with this crowd. And it's understandable. Vim, it's lightweight and fast. And Electron is in some sense an antithesis of that. But at the same time, today, there's no easier tech stack that's easier to ship cross-platform and validate an idea. What I found was there are a lot of Vimmers like me that were caught kind of bouncing or stuck, between, Vim and VS Code. Now from there, I started a company. I'm interested in bringing functional programming to desktop apps and games, some underserved areas. And at first, I worked on a few different projects, but eventually I had a fortuitous meeting with Jordan, the creator of React. I learned about a project he was working on called ReasonML. ReasonML is a functional language built on top of another language called OCaml that compiles to native. And at this time, I actually wasn't planning on building another editor. I had my fill with Onivim V1. But as I started working on this tech, I was thinking maybe I could deliver on an editor with this tech stack in a way that I couldn't before. So I started building and prototyping on this ReasonML tech stack. The first few builds were really rough. This was one of the first screenshots we shared, and it's little more than a tech demo. We were building the UI framework at the same time. Obviously, from a UX perspective, it's a little bit of a step backward from Onivim V1. But there were some exciting indications. One indication was the startup performance. Moving from Electron to our new ReasonML framework was just a huge improvement in our startup time. And these are the sorts of things that made me think hey, maybe I could deliver something great for this niche. OCaml is sometimes called the C of functional languages because of its performance and predictability. It has a great CFFI for dropping in for expensive work. So the end result was that we had about a 10x improvement in startup time. Onivim V1 would take about 5 seconds to start up before it would become interactive. Onivim V2 would take about a half second. And that's a pretty huge improvement. And of course, the reason for that startup time improvement is that in Onivim 1, when you load up the app, so much time is taken loading, parsing, and compiling JavaScript. That went down the rabbit hole of bundle splitting, figuring out ways to minimize that work up front. And there were surely more ways we could do that. But you hit a point of diminishing returns, especially as a very small team. But if you compile to native code, you skip those steps. You don't need to do that on startup, and that saves you a ton of time. From there, just kept building. Started to have more of an editor surface, a mini-map, syntax highlighting, fuzzy finder, explorer, a ski integration, started to integrate language support and completion. And we continued to improve until we're close to where we are today. Now the builds are still alpha. There's still a lot of work needed, but we've come such a long way. The vision for the project started to solidify. I wanted a modern experience and breaking free of the limitations of the terminal. something native and fast, VSCode compatibility, Vim compatibility, VimL compatibility, and easy to set up and easy to learn. Really, I just want to save other developers in the same boat as me from having to go through this whole journey and have a great solution that just works. So I want to show a demo of what I mean by modern experience, this idea of breaking free of terminal limitations. So let's fire up Onivim. This is a recent nightly build. There's no configuration. It's just out of box. Watch the startup time. You can tell it's not an Electron app. And when we're not stuck in a terminal and we're free from the limitation of a UI as a grid of character cells, there's a lot of cool things that we can do. You're going to notice the icons in the sidebar, the file icons, subligatures, an accidental hover. And we have sort of a supercharged status bar with a nice color transition for both messages and errors. Then check out the mini-map on the side. It's a great way to get an overview of your code. And it's actually functional too. Like if I search for a term, it'll get highlighted over in the mini-map. And then another feature we've added is per pixel smooth scroll. This is something that's really hard to do in a character-based grid. And this gives you some nice feedback as you're navigating around or changing the viewport. See, I'll turn off highlights so that you can see this next feature a little better. So we also highlight yanks. You kind of have to watch closely. It's subtle in this build. But this also gives some nice feedback, like did the command or the motion do what I expected it to? It's helpful for learning or just that confirmation that Vim did what I expected. We also have a rich hover experience. So if I press GH, I can get hover information. And again, I'm not limited to a single monospace font. I can have rich text and markdown display. We're also not limited to showing just buffer data. Like for some file types, like images, maybe we're better off just showing the image. It's probably more useful to you than the bytes. And because we're not in a terminal, we're not limited to monospace fonts. Have you ever had the urge to code in Comic Sans? Yeah, it'd be an experience. Note how the cursor size changes as I move through. It matches the size of the characters, which are variable. For me, I prefer modal editing in a monospace font, so I'll switch back. But these features serve multiple purposes. They can look cool, but for things like pair programming, it can be jarring for someone watching your screen as you move around a file. And the smooth scroll can give visual feedback and an indication of what's going on. And likewise for learning, if the screen just changes out from under me, that can be jarring as I'm playing with commands. The smooth scroll gives me an indication of what happened. So why are VS Code extensions important to this equation in my eyes? Vim itself has a great ecosystem of plugins. Well, there's a few reasons that I see. One is that they tend to just work. You don't have to string together and try and bring together a bunch of disparate plugins to get the experience you want. They help you set up tools and often will automatically download binaries you need. And it's insane how popular it is and it's become. In 2016, around 7% of developers were using code. 2018, about 35% of developers were using it. In 2019, over 50% of users were using it. It's just crazy how quickly it's grown. Although it's also crazy how many people still use Vim. It's really a UX that stood the test of time. But by virtue of that popularity, there is a huge community of users working hard on language plugins and grammars. I think it makes sense to ride that momentum and leverage all that hustle and energy that's going into these plugins. I see a trend where implementers will prioritize VS Code over any other editor by virtue of its popularity. But isn't it just an implementer of LSP? Like if we use an LSP solution, like Vim LSP or the NeoVim LSP, aren't we there in parity in terms of what VS Code gives us? I worry that it might not be the case. The scope of Visual Studio Code plugins is much larger than the language server protocol. So this file I'm scrolling through is the internal protocol for Visual Studio Code's extension host. They're really a proxy for the plugin API it exposes. Just looking through, there's all kinds of other aspects besides language features. Things like dialogues, virtual documents, quick input, terminal, source control, all sorts of things. Even the language features are a superset of what you get from the LSP. There's features that are exposed like semantic highlights or evaluatable expressions that aren't part of the LSP. So the gist is that what Visual Studio Code provides is a superset of the LSP, and some aspects are clearly out of scope of the language server protocol, like status bar integration or quick menus. But there are even language features that aren't part of the LSP. There's no guarantee they make it to the LSP. So I see a couple of possibilities. One case is these extension host language features trickle down into the LSP just after some time. And I've seen this where they'll kind of work out the kinks in the API in their internal protocol and then bubble it up to the LSP. Or it could be even that some of this functionality never makes it to the LSP. And at that point, like the VS Code plugin experience is sort of the premier experience, especially with this bulk of investment of all these people building VS Code plugins. It could be, even if with case 2, the LSP could still be good enough. Like maybe NeoVim plus Tree Sitter would outweigh missing something like semantic highlights. But I see all this momentum and there's no signs of it slowing down and all this cool functionality in the plugins. And I want a first-class modal experience around it. So I'm going to show another demo. We bundle several VS Code extensions out of the box, and these don't require any config. You just start coding, and they should just work. So let's fire up Onivim again. One extension we bundle is the TypeScript and JavaScript extension. So let's create a TypeScript file. I'm going to start coding. I get that rich completion experience right away. I get that hover too with the nice text formatting. If I go back, I can use GD to go to definition. Let's say I make a mistake. I'm redeclaring a constant. Get a nice error message, and the error is even highlighted in the minimap for me. So that's cool. Let's jump over to CSS file because we also have a CSS plugin built in. Again, I get that rich completion experience. Didn't have to set up anything. And because Onivim's written in Reason and OCaml, we also bundle the Reason and OCaml plugin. So, having this completion and rich language functionality is important for me as I'm working on Onivim. So that's cool. We bundle some extensions. That's great. But what about other VS Code extensions? So we actually support installing VS Code extensions from a registry called OpenVSX. The VS Code marketplace is actually proprietary, so we can't use that. But luckily, there's this kind of open repo of VS Code extensions that we use. Fire up Onivim again. I'm going to pop open a file. Then I'm going to open up our sidebar and go to our extensions pane. I'll use this functionality, Control G, which lets me kind of pseudo click on elements. I'm going to install a theme. I really like this Searchlights theme. And once it installs, it actually lets me preview the themes and shows me what themes are available. I kind of like this Searchlights theme, so I'm going to stick with that. Cool. Now let's install a C# plugin. Yeah, so I installed the plugin, and it actually wants an authentic C# experience. I'm going to skip those themes. It tells me a restart is required. So I'm going to close the editor. And I'm going to jump into my C# project and see what happens. So let's open the sidebar, make sure I'm in the right spot. Looks good. Let's open up program.cs. All right, meaty C# project here. Watch the status bar. The extension's downloading all my dependencies. It installed OmniSharp and the Razor language server. It's giving me status updates and these tooltips. And this little fire icon is showing me that the language server is running. And I didn't have to do anything except install the plugin. It also lets me see the C# projects I have in my solution, and I could switch between them if I wanted to. So it says it's working. Let's try and write some code. Switch your relative numbers, and let's try out hover. Yeah, looks good. All right, let's try some completion, see if we get that rich experience. Nice. And it knows about console, knows right and right line are there. Then let's see if signature help works. Nice. Now, so this is exactly what I wanted from the beginning, that rich language support. I don't think it should be any harder than this to get language support for your language of choice. In fact, I think it should be easier. You shouldn't have to really restart the editor. I need to fix that. You know, one thing to note is that download and status bar experience are things that are outside the scope of the LSP. You know, those are sort of premier functionalities that only the Visual Studio Code plugin gets. Now, looking at the use cases for Onivim, I sort of see the spectrum. On the left side, you have editors like VSCode, and these are easy to use, work out of the box. On the right side, you have Vim, which is more work to set up, but extremely powerful and customizable. Further in, you have VSCode Vim, NeoVim. And on the VSCode side, there's users who it works perfectly for. They've never experienced that pain of editing speed being the bottleneck. They're not interested in modal editing, or the VSCode Vim plugin gives them everything they need. You know, I'm envious of this set of users, and these users don't have much to gain by switching. On the Vim and NeoVim side, there's users who have perfectly manicured configuration, maybe years of blood, sweat, and tears poured into their VimRC or init Vim. So it's just right and exactly what they need. Again, there's no benefit to switch to another solution in that case. In the middle, there's people like me. Maybe they mostly use Vim, jump into VS Code to debug. Maybe they use mostly VS Code because their company has plugins that are required, but they drop into Vim for heavy text editing or use some sort of emulation. What I want for Onivim 2 is to build a great solution for that middle ground. And from there, we can look at expanding in both directions. You know, on the VS Code side, I want to make Onivim familiar, easy to learn, give you contextual information about what commands are available, give that nice visual feedback. On the Vim side, I want to have compatibility with VimL and pick up your customizations. I want to have a faithful Vim experience and that fast native performance. Now, it's really a matter of how far we push in each direction, and that's limited by time and resources. But the feedback we get is so helpful in guiding us through that prioritization. All right, so this last demo is the only one that isn't in our nightly build because I'm still working through some feedback and ideas. But the gist of it is we want to make it easy to have a faithful Vim experience in Onivim, the ability to opt into features you like, as well as opt out of features that get in your way or aren't useful for your workflow. So a criticism is that Onivim looks and feels too much like VS Code. I think it might be fair. We even bundle the Visual Studio Code theme. So you could switch to it, maybe trick some of your less discerning coworkers, like show them this and then dare them to quit. But more so, there's some Vim paradigms like Vim style tabs that aren't exposed at the beginning. These tabs that we have right now are actually buffer tabs in a window split. I'm gonna switch back to that Searchlights theme. But one thing we're experimenting with is the right set of defaults. We're sort of towing the line between two worlds, and it's one of the hardest non-technical problems of this project. But Vim users love the tab-based workflow. I mean, it's really unique to Vim. We want that available in Onivim too. I mean, it's likely they'll probably make it the default. But in this demo, I had an experimental PR where I have a Vim compatible setting. And if you set it, we'll sort of reset to more faithful Vim defaults. And here, the tabs that we show will now be Vim style tabs. So if I create a tab, now this is actually a Vim style tab, I can create a split inside it, and then navigate back to my previous tab with GT. Maybe create another tab, create a terminal. Nice. So again, I get that, Vim style tab experience. Now in this prototype, the Vim compatible setting turns off smooth scroll and minimap. Maybe I miss those. Maybe I kind of want that. But with my tab workflow, I can opt back into these with Vim settings, like set smooth scroll, which we've added. And I can bring the minimap back with set minimap. Of course, I could do the reverse. I could use set no smooth scroll or set no minimap to turn those off. But a big push for the current sprint that we're working on is having compatibility with Vim configuration and Vim key bindings. There's still a lot of work left to do. So how does this all work? How does it all come together? I'll give a quick overview of the architecture for those interested in the technical side. I could spend a whole hour presentation on this, so I'm going to move really fast. So we start with the Vim code base. And we extract out a minimal subset called libvim. And libvim is a really minimal build of Vim. We remove terminal UI rendering, a lot of rendering pieces, and we invert the flow of control. So instead of blocking on key presses, like do some logic, wait for a key press, do some logic, wait, we actually feed it input and then ask it what happened. And we wrap this up and expose it in a small header file called libvim.h. This is the engine of Onivim. Now, Onivim is the main consumer of libvim, but there's a cool project that uses it to create a Vim-powered editor in a game UI called Paravim, and it uses it for both nim and closure. Same author also built this really cool Vim cubed project, which uses libvim, adds a render on top, and renders it out to this spinning cube. I think that's pretty cool. All right, so back to libvim. We take libvim and we link it into a native GUI process. We also have a process to handle syntax highlighting, and this is our native front end. And this could really work standalone. Reverie is a native UI and application framework that we built for Onivim. It's cross-platform. The API is very much React inspired, but it compiles to native machine code. It uses Skia as the rendering engine and some other libraries like HarfBuzz for text shaping. And this is our example app for Reverie. It's more general than Onivim or a code editor. Like it has more general primitives. You could build other sorts of applications, like this calculator example contributed by Ohad. But these are the primitives that we use to build Onivim. All right, let's shift gears, talk about VSCode's architecture. VSCode is an Electron app with a front-end process, which is a browser UI, and a back-end process called the extension host. And this orchestrates the Visual Studio Code extensions. Those might spin up their own language servers, and it handles sort of the mediation of those. And they talk to each other via that extension host protocol, that giant file that I showed earlier. So we split out the extension host. We sort of decouple it from Electron and allow it to run standalone via Node. Then we take it, we bring it to our front end. And on our front end, we put on a disguise. We dress it up like it's VS Code. I mean, looks shady, but we're just using MIT licensed pieces and talking over that open source protocol. And we end up talking to the extension host as if we were Visual Studio Code. And it's really interesting. I don't think there's another editor that has coupled the Visual Studio Code backend, the extension host, with a native front end. So Onivim is very unique in that aspect. This idea of bringing together the best of both worlds is very literal in our architecture. We've got pieces of Vim and pieces of Visual Studio Code. We're trying to bring them together. The cool thing about this is, unlike solutions like Talk, we don't need to fork Visual Studio Code extensions. We just bring them in as they are. Now, the downside is it's very technically challenging. Building a UI framework is something that can take large teams years. I mean, there's so many issues we've had to work through. High DPI, device scaling, font fallback, font rendering, having a platform for shipping and code signing cross-platform. Same with the GUI code editor. Like, think of the resources behind projects like code. And just getting these disparate pieces wired up is a huge challenge. There's so much to do. It's not something that you can do like a couple hours a week. So a funding and sustainability model is really important. Funding an open source project is hard. It's hard even in the best case. Not to mention a case like Onivim, that's really a niche within a niche. And it's not fun at all. The last thing I want to spend my day doing is reviewing a EULA with a lawyer, or integrating a payment provider. I would love to just focus on code, the end product, and delivering a great user experience. So I tried a donor model at first, but it's hard. There's a lot of people that would support, but don't, because you're not really giving anything back. It's also taxing mentally to take money from people without giving them something. It's sort of a nebulous transaction. So I switched to kind of an experimental model called a time delay dual license. And really, this is asking more of an investment from users that are interested, but in a way that everything still ends up eventually open source. So we have in our main repo a standard software license, a EULA, and to use it commercially, you need a EULA. Purchasing one is one way, but if you submit a fix or a feature, we'll give you one too. Really, we just want you to contribute something to the project. And downloads are available for users with the license. But beyond that, we actually relicense all our commits to MIT after 18 months. We have a script that runs every night that just takes the last commit from 18 months ago and relicenses it. And that's in the Onivim Oni2 MIT repo. So everything ends up open source by design. It's just a matter of time. And so far, over 100 commits have been relicensed, although it's much closer to the first screenshot I showed than the last. And our satellite projects like LibVim, Reverie, and other dependencies are just MIT licensed. And so far, I think this strikes a nice compromise. We have something to give back to users that support the project. It lights a fire for us to make progress, but everything eventually ends up open source. I think if we can deliver on the solution that just works, you can get your favorite language working and a great experience without having to wrestle your config. It saves you an hour or two of configuration. It's paid for itself. But in my eyes, a key ingredient for sustainable open source is to sort of have products at the leaf nodes that give back to the ecosystem of their open source dependencies. Imagine if big companies gave back like 1% from their products to their open source dependency stack. Might not have a problem funding open source anymore. Now, I don't know how to do that, but at least for Onivim, we give back a percentage of proceeds to both Vim and NeoVim. We're climbing up the leaderboard on Vim's Hall of Honor. It'd be great to get to #1. And we don't depend technically on NeoVim anymore, but I love the work they're doing, the way they push the ecosystem forward, the features they implement like Terminal and Tree Sitter. Ultimately, I'm a fan of both these projects, and Onivim wouldn't be here without these. If you're a Vim or NeoVim user, I'd encourage you to, if you haven't already, give back to these projects. Think about the value they give to you. At the end of the day, whatever tool you use, and you should use the best tool for the job for you, I'll always cheer on my fellow developers. So what's next for Onivim? Well, we just shipped our 0.5.0 alpha, and all the demos I showed you, except for the very last one, are from that nightly build. The major feature there was getting some of the top VSCode extensions working and wiring up that extension host, exposing more language features. This was a big technical unknown prior to that milestone. Like, can we even make this happen? Can we wire up those pieces? And we have a story for it now. But I'm really excited about the work we're doing now for our end of October 0.6.0 build. There's several places where we fall short in terms of a faithful Vim experience. And I want to tackle those and improve. Supporting Vim navigation across the UI, pulling in as much as we can from your Vim config, supporting pure VimL plugins like Fugitive, Surround, and deep integration with features like marks, registers, quick fix, and location lists. To me, this is the last major technical unknown, wiring up these missing pieces. And I'm really excited to dive in and break it down. Past that, for the end of the year, I want to have an auto update. And end of 2020, I'd like to have trial builds in place. And once we trim some of the low-hanging fruit and add a little more polish. Right now, the builds are very much alpha quality. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, bug fixes, especially what we consider daily editor blockers, stabilization, performance. Work needs to be done on input, IME, and localization, and lots of polish. It can feel pretty daunting sometimes, but it's also exciting how far we've come. And really the key for us is to prioritize. And users have been so helpful in voting in the GitHub issues, like putting thumbs up to help us pick that right set of priorities to focus on. So it's going to be a busy end to this crazy year, but I'm really excited to get there. I think the foundation we have is really promising and has so much potential. And I really want to realize that and get to that place of the best of both worlds, modal editing from the future. So a quick blurb about our team. I'm full-time on Onivim right now. Brian Cross is a full-time PhD student, but he's part-time working with me on Onivim. He's been working with He's been working with me since the Onivim 1 days. He's done a ton of work on our Windows setup, our fuzzy finder, quick open. Chances are, if you've had a question, he's the first person to be there to answer and help you out. Zach Balin interned with us over the summer, and prior to that, he contributed several features to Reverie. He delivered some awesome features like markdown rendering, signature help, hover, font fallback, among others. And all our contributors I consider part of our team. Like Glenn has made some incredible contributions like source control and diff markers. Akin helped early on build out the file explorer, and he helped a lot with Onivim 1. Anton has built out our text input. I really appreciate all the help. And I want to give a shout out to Jordan too, who has given us a lot of help and assistance to get this off the ground and building out the ReasonML infrastructure. So ultimately the goal I have with Onivim is to deliver a best-in-class experience for that niche of a niche with great language support and modal editing as a first-class citizen. A beautiful, easy to use package. There's still a ton of work to be done, but we've also made a lot of progress. Thanks for watching the talk, and thanks to everyone who supported the project. It helped us get this far, build out this new tech stack and code editor, whether it's purchasing a license, supporting us on Patreon, troubleshooting bugs, giving feedback, or just words of encouragement. We could really use all the help we can get. And big thanks to Adam for organizing this conference, giving me the opportunity to present. He did an amazing job putting this together. Feel free to reach out to me. Let me know if you have questions or ideas. And thanks a lot for tuning in. Stay safe. I'll catch you later.